Hello everyone, my name is Paul Buitink and welcome at a new episode of Café Weltschmerz, and I'm very honored to have today with me Professor Steve Keen. Steve, welcome.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. It's also a bit lucky we are because you live in Holland at least part-time these days.
Yeah, no, I'm living and renting in a place right now with a girlfriend, and I've bought a place which I'm moving into in August.
Oh, nice.
So it'll be a permanent move over here.
So do you like Amsterdam so far?
I love it. I mean, I've been coming here since 2004. And I just, I like the vibe of the place. It's a fairly Australian expression to use, but it's the relaxed nature of it, the engineering that is the reason why the place even exists.
Yeah.
Nobody is going to be saying we should have free markets and deregulation here, because what they're saying is we think Amsterdam should be 3 metres below sea level. Because if it wasn't for the collective effort half a millennium ago, you wouldn't have Amsterdam to begin with. So I find a strength in the philosophy and the engineering in Holland that I really appreciate, compared to the UK, which I think is a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, especially now, of course. And but are you still teaching in the
Still
UK?
Teaching at Kingston. At the moment I'm supposed to finish at the end of this coming academic year. There's plans to try to get me to extend my stay there. So I'll be teaching the introductory course called Becoming an Economist, and I have 2 master's courses I'll be teaching if that plan goes ahead. One is the political economy course, because Engelbert Stockhammer, who is our professor who currently teaches that, Engelbert now has a good position at King's College. So he's moving over to King's College, which I think is positive for King's College, different for Kingston.
Yeah.
And so I'm taking over one of his subjects, and I'm also teaching half of the course called Economic Change and Ideas.
So both the Brits and the Dutchies can enjoy your presence the coming time.
Yeah.
I've got to know you because of your books, Debunking Economics First, and then your latest, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? Which is a bit of a loaded question, I would say. That will also be the main theme of today, whether we can avoid a financial crisis, what can we do about it, and also how you derive to such insights. Maybe first, last Sunday we had in Switzerland the Vollgeld referendum. Is introducing sovereign money into the system and making it impossible for commercial banks to create money out of thin air. Is that a way to avoid the next financial crisis?
I'm on the Positive Money Advisory Board, so I have a lot of time for positive money attitudes in general.
And Positive Money is in the UK.
Positive Money is the UK version of the group that did the referendum in Switzerland. So we've got serious problems with the financial system, without a doubt, and the private banks have been appalling in how they've executed what is effectively a public trust of money creation. But I'm not totally in favour of 100% government-created money, for a reason we can talk about later if you like. But to me, the good thing about that referendum was at least it raised the issue. And I think about 1/3 of the population voted, and about 1/5 of those voted for the referendum. So that's not a lot, but it's at least some public awareness, which wouldn't have been the case before the financial crisis.
Yeah, let's dive into the solutions later on in this conversation, but at least, like you said, it's good to know that so many people are actively working on trying different solutions to heal our financial system and our society as a whole, I would say. So could you explain a little bit more first your background? How did you get into economics, and have you always been a rebel like this?
I think I probably have. I look back at my personality at school, and I was not somebody who enjoyed being told what I regarded as bullshit.
There's much bullshit out there.
Economics has got so much bullshit, it makes the Sisyphean, Hercules had a pretty easy job, really, in the cleaning up the Sisyphean staples, I think it was called.
Yeah.
But I swallowed it at school, because we got a very advanced level of teaching of economics at school compared to what you got now. For example, one of the books I read for my school course was John Hicks's The Trade Cycle.
Okay.
Now you don't even discuss the business cycle these days. I had Lipsy, I think, as my textbook at school, and I went through indifference curves and all this sort of stuff, which when you look in things like Manq, are shown as an advanced topic taught in second year or something like that. And so we had a very, very deep training in it, and I accepted the whole logic. I was a very strident believer in what I didn't know was neoclassical economics. It was economics, I thought. And then I got to, one part of that also makes you very a zealot who wants to get rid of trade unions and get rid of monopolies, because if you get rid of those two, you have a better world. And I remember writing an essay virtually to that effect from very early on in my first year at university. And then in that first year lectures, we had a guy called Frank Stilwell, who became Professor of Political Economy at Sydney after several events that I had a very large hand in. And Frank taught us what's called the theory of the second best. But this won the Nobel Prize for, I think, Kelvin Lancaster and one other person. So it's seriously respected economic theory. And that said that, the example that Frank gave us, if you have the ideal of supply and demand, then the supply of labour and the demand for labour, where they meet, that's the ideal point. And you only get there if you have no trade unions and no monopolies. He said, now, but if we start in the real world, you'll have both trade unions and not necessarily monopoly buyers of labour, but powerful buyers of labour. What happens if you abolish one or the other? Well, the theory of the second best shows you make the situation worse. Okay? Yep. Provably make it worse. And I remember seeing that in class and thinking, this is crazy, because I was driven by this vision of perfection, and then as soon as you admit two little elements of the real world, there are trade unions, there are powerful employer groups, and you apply the theory by getting rid of one but not the other. Of course, trade unions have been destroyed in the last 40 years. Monopolies have done very well, thanks very much. You make the situation...
being a great example of being a monopolist while destroying the power of the individual.
And so I thought there's got to be something wrong with the theory. So rather than just relying upon the textbooks, I started reading the journal papers, and I discovered to my amazement that there'd been this huge debate in economics starting back in the early 1960s over what is capital. You have capital you define as money, which obviously you can add money together and so on, it's very fungible. There's also capital defined as machinery. And how do you add a computer to a watch? So that issue was in fact won by the critics of the theory, Joan Robinson and friends at Cambridge University in the UK. The leader of the defending group was in Cambridge University, in the University of Massachusetts in Cambridge, America, Paul Samuelson. And Samuelson actually wrote at the end of it, summing up, a paper called The Summing Up. He said that, summing up the debate, the critics are right, effectively. We can't add capital together. He said, and if this makes us long for the old parables of neoclassical economics, we must appreciate the scholars are not born to live an easy life. We must respect and appraise the facts of life. Now that was in 1971, 72, I think. And so you find Paul Samuelson saying we have to change our theory because it's been proven to us, and he accepted it as the architect of that theory, that we can't define capital as we have defined capital. Now you fast forward now and they're still teaching the same garbage.
But take, for example, my watch. It can be either, it's probably seen as a consumer good, but I use it to make sure I'm on time in meetings.
It's involved in production.
It's also for me a capital good as well.
Yeah, there's capital goods. How do you add capital goods together? So that whole debate was completely ignored by the mainstream. They lost the debate, and then now if you ask them, they think they won the debate. Okay? Right. So this sort of intellectual flaw was just right throughout mainstream economics, and I went from being a believer in it in the beginning of first year to a complete critic by the end of first year, and then started reading more broadly again. And in 1973 at Sydney University, there was two major events happened. First of all, very major event, Australia pulled out of the Vietnam War. And at that stage, I was one of many students who decided we were opposed to conscription, opposed to the war. So there's all this anti-war fervour.
So fighting for freedom, it's...
Yeah, being conscripted to fight for freedom didn't seem like much sense to me, and I faced conscription.
Sort of fucking for virginity. Like
I was willing to be a draft resister. If Whitlam hadn't won the election, I had my bags packed to go and join the draft resistors union that night. Didn't have to do it, unpack my bags. But all the energy that was put into fighting the Vietnam War was suddenly put into fighting criticising the thought we were being taught at university. Some very good, others pretty bad. So every department had some sort of student rebellion about the nature of teaching. And in the philosophy department, there was a strike. They called for a strike across the whole university because the staff had voted in favour of putting on a course called Philosophical Aspects of Feminist Thought, and the professor had blocked it, and then it fought all the way up the hierarchy until finally the Vice-Chancellor blocked it. And with that dynamic, they said, let's go on strike to protest this, which they did, and then a strike began in economics to support them. I was one of the three leaders of that strike, and finally we actually fought for a Department of Political Economy at Sydney University, and we won that battle. So my fighting against economics goes back to 1971.
Yeah, it's amazing. So almost 50 years of fighting. And there's a few fundamental flaws, as you described also in your latest book, with neoclassical models. Like for example, they assume everyone is acting rationally. They assume you can just easily aggregate individual curves to sort of get this ideal average consumer, for example, or a company. They omit bank and credit and money.
That's the one that I focus upon, but that's most obviously wrong.
I think that's the one we should address maybe most in this conversation. But after all these years, like 10 years ago, we had the great financial crisis. So I would assume that since it should be commonly known that there are certain flaws with the models, and they cannot really predict depressions, because they thought since we didn't have a depression for so long, we're probably safe. But would you would expect that the models would have been updated by now then?
Yeah, no, this is to update the models. You have to. The update that's necessary is like going from Ptolemy's vision of the universe, where the Earth is at the centre and all the planets are on perfect spheres around the Earth, and the reason you can explain why Mars occasionally appears to reverse direction is because it's on another circle called an epicycle built on the main circle called the deferent, etc., etc. To go from that to saying, no, the Sun is the centre of the solar system and the Earth is just one of the planets that spins around the Sun, that is a total change of paradigm. Now, neoclassical economics, to bring in banks, debt and money into their models and to go from equilibrium to non-equilibrium thinking is a complete paradigm shift. And they were shaken so badly by the financial crisis because, according to them, it couldn't happen and it wouldn't happen because they were managing the economy.
And they threw the models out of the window at first, right? That's
well, the panic response was literally, I mean, I was lucky enough to meet Ed Lazaire, who was George Bush's chief economic advisor. And he wrote a paper in 1999 called Economic Imperialism, and he championed economics as being the only true science in the social sciences. And a major part of it was the use of equilibrium and how important it was to think in equilibrium and insist on equilibrium and so on. And of course, he was in charge when the financial crisis began. He didn't hand over to Obama's staff until, I think it's February 2009. That's because the election in 2008. So he described to me what it was like inside the Bush panic when the crisis hit. He said it was sheer panic. And the state of mind of people in the Bush cabinet was, these were all staunch believers in mainstream economics, staunch market imperialists, himself obviously. You had, I've forgotten the Bush obviously as well, the head of the Treasury, who was a Goldman Sachs character.
Paulson.
Hank Paulson, thank you. And he said basic attitude was capitalism wasn't going to fail on our watch.
Yeah.
Okay, we'd do whatever was necessary to save capitalism. So all the textbooks went out the window. They threw huge amounts of money at the economy. Most of that got siphoned off into the financial sector, of course. But it was we're not going to be the ones who go down in history as having been at the helm when capitalism crashed.
Yeah.
So that was how panicked they were at the time. But then, and that's sort of the main leaders, the people who wrote the mainstream models, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, as they call them, DSGE models, they were in shock as well.
Yeah, like for example, I when I was studying economics at the university in Rotterdam, the main textbook in the first year was from Olivier Blanchard.
Yeah.
And I think he was a head economist of
the IMF at the time.
And you know him personally?
We've corresponded on Twitter, not just like privately as well as publicly. And he's, like most economists, he's an extremely decent person. A lot of people criticise economists and say they're in the pocket of the capitalists, or they're doing it because they're being paid. No way. No. I mean, most academics get lousy pay, and in fact, economists are responsible for that pay getting worse over time. They do it because
unless you're head economist, of course, at a bank, like Willem Buiter of like City, I'm sure.
Goldman Sachs is a good way to make a profit, make a good living. But most academic economists earn a pretty, it used to be a comfortable living, now it's a pretty uncomfortable one. So they're hardly doing it because they're being paid to do it. They simply believe it. And Olivier was like that. He believed the whole thing. He actually wrote a paper in August of 2008. He published the paper called The State of Macro. And in that paper, he said the state of macro is good. This is 1 year after the crisis began. We actually date the crisis properly from August in 2007. So even 1 year later, he was still saying everything's good with macro.
But it sounds so naive. I mean, that's almost nefarious that you are, like a year later, you still don't realize that the state of macro is not good at all. And in fact, well,
he finally began to realise that after time. And actually, one thing I'll say very strongly in Olivier's favour, on my screensaver happens to be a memo he wrote at the IMF opposing the Greek bailout terms.
Okay.
He wrote it internally. It was leaked. He didn't do the leaking. But he was saying even if the Greeks fulfil everything we've proposed in this program, no economy in history has taken a hit of something of the order of 16% of GDP, reduction in spending in 1 year. There'll be, even if they follow the program exactly, the economy could still fail. And of course there'll be failures in how the program is carried out. So he fought internally to stop that program.
And the whole process, IMF was far more reasonable than the Eurocrats.
Yeah, so you've got to give a positive in favour of Olivier there. But he still can't help but think in a neoclassical way, because if you look at the amount of training that's involved in getting to the stage where we can actually derive one of these models, they are so difficult to derive, so many intricate steps are necessary to derive one of these models that your brain really doesn't have space for anything else. It's like you've learned how to be a violin player, and you spend so much of your time with violins that you don't know how to boil water. Okay, it gets that extreme,
and also because they have invested their whole careers in this whole concept. So if they would have to sort of disagree with everything they've been saying for all these decades, then of course they have a reputational issue as well to deal with.
So that locks you into a way of thinking, and it's very, very hard for anybody to have done that much work in a particular way of seeing the world to shift to a different way of seeing the world. And like my favourite instance of this is actually Max Planck, the physicist Max Planck. Now, what Max Planck did is bring in quantum mechanics, and the reason he did it was there was a particular experiment called the black body radiation experiment. How much heat is radiated at different frequencies out of a black body, like this would be defined as a black body, and what you get is a curve that looks like a pimple. Okay. Now, when you fitted the Maxwellian equations to that, you either got this prediction for the amount of energy from going from low frequency to high to go off to infinity, or the opposite direction, infinite energy at low frequency. So Max Planck just sat down to do the mathematics one day and had he did what's called integration in the complex plane. And what he found was he could only fit the data if energy came in distinct little units called quanta. That's where the idea of quantum mechanics came from. Now, he didn't know why that was the case. He didn't like that it was the case, but it was the only way to fit the data. So he tried to persuade his colleagues, who were all trained in Maxwellian physics, and he finally realised they're not going to understand it, they'll never accept it. So he wrote the little line, "Science advances one funeral at a time." Yeah. So it isn't just economics that does this, but of course physics has experiments you can't contradict. The Mitchison-Morley one about the speed of light in both directions around, there's no ether. The ether theories had to go. Those definitive experiments mean that ideas which are appealing and people believe they actually describe the real world, they finally find, well, it can't describe a crucial element. We know of the real world, so even if we can't let it go, the students behind us start to learn it and they change. And that's what Max Planck said, that you have to rely upon the new who can absorb, the new students who can absorb the new ideas. The old ones, you just have to wait for them to retire or die. Economics, unfortunately, doesn't have that, even the financial crisis.
Hyman Minsky was sort of the Max Planck then of economics to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, I read huge amounts of other theoreticians of economics before I read Minsky. I read Minsky, as it happens, for a master's essay assignment in 1987. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, this is the first explanation of capitalism's strengths and weaknesses that makes sense to me. Because what he said was, if you read people like Paul Sweezy, and Magdoff and so on, they would talk in terms of capitalism having a tendency towards underconsumption, not enough demand for the goods produced, and therefore this tendency to stagnate. And that didn't gel with me. And then what Minsky said is the fundamental instability of a capitalist economy is upward. The tendency to turn doing well into a speculative investment boom is the fundamental weakness of a capitalist economy, and I thought that nails it.
I think so too. Yeah, I mean, I'm 37, so I've been through certain cycles already, and every time you see the same thing. And with all manias, because the future, that's also what you nicely describe in your book. The future is uncertain, so we have no clue. So the best most people do is just look at the past, and they see.
And they extrapolate.
They extrapolate. So they see, for example, a certain asset rise in value, whether it's real estate or Bitcoin or whatever. And then possibly most of them say, okay, this must be good, so
dive in.
Let's buy. And then you come at this point where it's unsustainable, and then it all comes crashing down again.
Yeah, so Minsky's vision was, to me, very, very powerful. And one thing I say to my students in the introductory course at Kingston is that there are different schools of economic thought. Mainstream economics denies that there are, but there are different schools. And they start with a particular question. And you can't actually rule the questions out on their first basis. So the question that defines the neoclassical vision, effectively, is can a group of of different markets reach a state of general equilibrium where demand is equal to supply in all markets? That's an interesting question. Okay? You can't rule it out on the first principles. Minsky's question was, can another Great Depression happen?
Yeah.
And if it hasn't happened, why hasn't it? If it hadn't happened by the time he was writing, which is in the 1980s, why has it not happened?
And his answer was yes, right? It can happen.
It can
because
happen,
it's prone capitalism or financial capitalism, especially
Yeah.
Because of the possibility to create money out of thin air or private
Yeah.
debt. Because his tutor Schumpeter, of course, is famous for this whole creative destructionism term. So he was already into there are cycles, but then Hyman sort of added the fuel in this whole process is private debt creation.
That's the thing which is missing in Schumpeter's analysis. So Schumpeter, there's a book I highly recommend people reading called Theory of Economic Development, very short book by Schumpeter, which describes how capitalism is a cyclical system. He starts from believing the neoclassical vision of equilibrium, but he says in equilibrium there's no profit. Okay, you pay the rate of interest to buy everything, you pay workers their marginal product. By definition, there is no, neoclassical will say there's normal profit. You say they're after supernormal profit. How do they get it? Well, they've got to disrupt production. They have to come up with some technology which gives you a dramatic cost advantage. And then he says those technologies will tend to come in clumps and clusters, and the technology itself will be financed by people being given money by banks, which is credit creation. So all this was in Schumpeter. But what he had was just like a vision of a set of cycles going on forever. Minsky added in that people will effectively borrow money during a boom and have to repay it during a slump. And what you get is a ratcheting up of debt over time that leads to a level of debt where finally the economy can't cope and you have a Great Depression.
And did he then also predict the financial crisis to take place more or less in a certain year, or he was more...
Oh, no. Again, when Minsky's attempts to mathematically model his own thesis failed because he chose the wrong model. He chose what's called Hicks's model of the trade cycle, or it's called the multiplier accelerator model. And I'd already shown in my master's before I read Minsky that model was mathematically correct but economically invalid. It's that model, if you can actually build Hicks's model by asking yourself a question: if consumption and investment both depend upon the level of income, what level of income will guarantee that actual consumption is equal to desired investment? Now, that is not a question that Keynes asked. Keynes said actual investment is equal to actual savings, not desired to actual. The way Hicks phrased it was desired investment to actual consumption. The answer is zero output. So it was actually a trivial model. And that's what Minsky tried to modify that model to make it fit his idea. He got nowhere, so he finally gave it the mathematics. My contribution was having been trained in, we were both trained in mathematics, but I learned from differential equations, and to me, economics had to be about differential equations. You had to be thinking in terms of rates of change. And I learnt of the Goodwin model, and I put the two together, and I built a model which actually gave me Minsky's hypothesis.
Yeah, and the model's called Minsky, aptly called. That's the model you have.
Well, yeah, Minsky. I've now developed a software package I call Minsky, named after Hyman Minsky. It isn't just to build Minsky models. It can build models of anything. It's a general what's called system dynamics tool. What it adds to the other programs that already exist in the marketplace are what I call Godley tables, again named after Wynne Godley. And these are tables that enable you to show financial transactions using the ultimate GUI, graphical user interface for money, double entry bookkeeping.
Yeah.
So you put these Godley tables in there, and you can show money creation. You can show all the dynamics that way. So Minsky as a theory is Hyman and the financial instability hypothesis. Minsky as a software application is system dynamics modeling for complex systems with special tools for modeling money. And
what does your model currently say about the economy, and can we avoid another financial crisis?
Yeah, well, we've got to see what
it's
causes
it's sort of a glass you want to look into.
We come back to what actually caused the last one. And Minsky's hypothesis effectively said that he saw a relationship between income and debt. And he actually has a phrase saying the point we should start from to understand the relationship between debt and income is to take an economy which has had a financial crisis in the recent past but is now doing well. He said, since it's recovered from the crisis, people's memories of the crisis recede, and because they recede, they become more optimistic, so they're more willing to invest. because they're more willing to invest, that causes a boom in the economy, and the boom itself has to be financed by them borrowing money to invest more than their retained earnings for this investment boom. So they take on this additional debt to do it. As the economy starts to boom, and this is what I explained in my book, and Minsky didn't understand this, he had a different mechanism. As the boom goes on, that gives workers more capacity to get wage rises. It gives raw materials suppliers more capacity to get higher prices. That changes the distribution of income. So when you get to the top of the boom, capitalists are getting less than they thought they'd be getting. Therefore, their desire to invest declines, and you then go down into a slump. But when you recover, when you start to get to the bottom, you start having workers accepting wage cuts, and you pay some of the debt down, interest rates drop, so there's a bit of a recovery. You get back to the point where capitalists are happy to invest all that they earn again. That will have a period where bankers have now got extra income, the debt levels risen, workers have fallen more, and you have a change in the distribution of income, meaning you start from a higher level of debt with a lower share going to workers. Next boom, same thing, and it keeps on happening. Worker shares going down.
Debt upon debt.
Private debt's rising, but in a cyclical fashion. Worker share is going down. Capitalists are getting much the same level when cycles all the way through. You get to the point where you accumulate so much debt that the next downturn, workers' wage rises aren't enough to compensate for the extra leverage on debt, and you have an explosion in debt and a crisis. Yeah. And that's what we went through. Yeah.
So is then the key here to avoid this debt buildup, that you need to sort of restrain banks and other entities? The shadow banking system, of course, also a very important element here. You need to kind of restrain them from creating too much credit.
Yeah,
and that, of course, the Swiss initiative would be like a very radical way to cut off the whole credit creation process.
By stopping them from being able to create money in the first place. Yeah, but this comes back to the essential role of creating money in macroeconomics and the essential role of private debt in macroeconomics. And again, this is something which I've been working on for the last 20 or so years in various ways, and building on the work of a recently deceased post-Keynesian economist called Basil Moore. And Basil developed what he called the endogenous money stock, to say that money is not determined by the government, which is the mainstream model. The mainstream model simply says, if you go back to what's called the ISLM model, it says there's a fixed money supply and the government can vary at will by varying the, changing the amount of reserves in the economy or changing the ratio between reserves and deposits.
Yeah, and bank money is just the money multiplier of the reserves that are being...
That's right,
but it's also, of course, bullshit, because...
It's total bullshit, because it's not how banks behave at all. But this is the theory that they've got. They call their assumptions simplifying assumptions. I actually call them complicating assumptions, because they make a complicated assumption to make the paradigm fit the data. Okay, that's what they're doing in many, or they make it just to make the paradigm function. And part of their paradigm has to say money is just a veil over barter. Money is not essential. If you actually understand macroeconomics better, you understand the global economy better. If you forget about money and banks and all that sort of stuff, it's just periphery. That's crap, but that's what they believe. So that's why they were completely sidelined by the crisis in 2007.
And you saw the debt crisis coming, because you wrote about it, especially the US bubble, I think.
More Australian, because I was living in Australia at the time. But
an Australian bubble is popping at the moment. I saw Sydney house prices for the past few months.
Ah, dear.
You've been warning everyone about it, but
crocodile. I'll be trying marsupial crocodile tears over that one when it finally bursts. But having done I did theoretical work on Minsky back in my PhD. So I wrote a mathematical model of Minsky's thesis that worked to generate his phenomena in 1993. I think it was 92 or 93, published in 95. So I was aware of that. Then I got involved in writing Debunking Economics. I started writing that in 99, finished it in 2000, 2001. And then I got involved in a huge battle with neoclassical economists over some of my critiques of the theory of the firm. So all that sort of stuff took about 4 years. And in 2005, I thought I was ready to start writing my Minsky book, effectively. And I got asked to be an expert witness on a court case on predatory lending in Australia. And that, because there's been this huge gap between finishing my PhD and teaching and all this sort of jazz, I hadn't really looked at the data for 10 years. And so I was writing my expert witness report. And this is about 2 o'clock in the morning about 10 o'clock in the evening one evening. And I wrote a line saying, private debt, the ratio of private debt to GDP has been rising exponentially. Now,
so that's the metric to always keep an eye on, the private debt versus GDP.
That's what I focus because of Minsky's thesis.
So not public debt, because that's most people
private
look at
debt is unfortunately irrelevant.
Well, in the Eurozone, of course, it is, because the countries cannot issue their own currency.
That's the Eurozone is I call it a suicide pact. But anyway, so back to private debt. I knew the level of private debt and its rate of change mattered, but I hadn't looked at them for about a decade. Okay, so when I wrote this line about the ratio rising exponentially, I thought, well, I can't rely upon hyperbole, because as an expert in the Australian legal system, you might be paid for by one side or the other, but you are beholden to the court. So you can't make a hyperbolic statement; it has to be backed up. So I had to download the data, pull in quarterly GDP data, monthly debt data, write some algorithms to handle the whole thing.
That scared the shit out of you.
I did it I finished at 2 o'clock in the morning and graphed the first graph, and I still remember looking at it and just going, holy shit, I don't need to change the word exponential. I did a quick regression on the data, and the fit of the Australian data from 1965, I think it was, until 2005 at that time, to a simple exponential function, had a correlation coefficient, I think, of 0.9971. I said, I don't need to remove the word exponential. And then I said, well, looking at that, I thought, shit, this is Australia. What's happening globally? There wasn't easily available data, but I knew I could probably find it in the American system. So I downloaded the Federal Reserve data, did the same graph, and I didn't find quite the same exponential fit. It was about 0.95, but it's going back from 1945 through to 2005, another exponential rate of growth. I thought, there's going to be a crisis because this can't continue. Yeah,
you've tracked it for many different countries, right? And
I have now.
So you're sort of classified two groups. You have the debt zombies and the to become zombies. Could you explain that concept?
Well, countries like America had such a level of credit-based demand that when credit stopped growing, demand collapsed. So the peak point for America's private debt to GDP was 1.7 times GDP. That happened a year or so after the financial crisis began. But what was causing that debt ratio to rise was the change in debt being faster than the change in GDP. So in 2007, for example, the increase in private debt that year was equivalent to 15% of GDP. That meant that was 15% of equivalent of GDP spent into asset markets, goods markets, and so on. And that was going to go negative. I was sure of that. It went from plus 15 to minus 6. That's effectively like a 20% loss in GDP, of GDP demand and aggregate demand over a 2-year period. And that was the first time you'd had negative credit since 1945. So that's what I was identifying as going to happen. Now, countries that had that happen to them included Spain, Ireland, the UK, Portugal, Netherlands to some extent, but not as severe because of your trade surplus. But all those countries have become effectively zombified because they've only reduced their debt a bit from that level. So it's a bit like you've got to Mount Everest level and you start to suffocate, you come back down again, but you only come down far enough that you can still see the peak. Well, it means your capacity to climb that level of debt again is fairly limited. So credit-based demand in America, which peaked at 15% in 2007, bottomed at minus 6 in 2010, is now running at about 6 or 7% of GDP, but it's not going to get back to 15 again. So the extra demand is fairly minor.
Yeah, so there's still this huge debt overhang then that needs to be dealt with.
That's right.
And so what is your solution then in order to if sentiment turns and if there a new slump starts? Or if you want to sort of reset the system, what would be the best way to do it?
Well, the best way is the old way, and that's called a jubilee.
So and go back to the Bible and just do a periodical.
Even further than the Bible, back to Sumerians, back to 3000 BC. But a common practice, and we find this, Michael Hudson and Cornelia Wunsch have done most of the research on this. Cornelia actually reads ancient Babylonian, so she's translated all these little texts that are written in the cuneiforms.
Yeah.
She speaks 13 languages, a bit more than me. I speak
We're going to focus on Dutch with you first, and then we can do better. First things first.
First things first. But they found that the Babylonians would explain that the level of debt tended to rise exponentially, whereas the level of agricultural productivity rose and then flatlined, what's called a sigmoid curve. They didn't use those functions, but they were using sequences that gave you those results. And what they'd show is the debt would be reset, and then you'd go back again, reset, reset, reset. So it became a common practice to reset the debt every 50 years, Or
so they would just break the clay tables that they were writing the debt on, and then we could just...
And free. It was not debt between commercial people. It was debt between landless, basically people who became debt slaves, were freed of debt slavery. And that was an essential part of the society surviving, because they were your foot soldiers. And they could only be recruited if they were freemen. So the state had a vested interest in eliminating the debt, and often the debt was to itself. So that was the old system. But regular jubilees became part of the ancient practice until the Roman Empire. Then you had a few of them happening sometimes, I think, in the medieval period, but they were pretty much gone. But what that meant was you broke this accumulation of debt. Now, we think we're so much smarter than them, but we haven't even worked out that debt plays a role in the economy yet. The mainstream still ignores private debt and credit completely in analysing capitalism. But if we get to the stage where this much debt is taken on, the only way you get out of it is by resetting the debt. Now, the way we reset the debt last time round, which is the Great Depression, was a simple little process. We decided to kill 70 million of us in the Second World War. And the level of military spending there was so gigantic that the economy boomed, even though it was booming and bombing at the same time. And that huge level of government spending enabled the private sector to massively reduce its debt level. So the debt, roughly speaking, the debt in America went from being something in the order of 140% of GDP at its peak, comparing it to current data, down to 20 to 30% of GDP.
So you want more government spending, or shall we just give people cash?
This is what we can do now, because one thing that the Swiss referendum was about to say, well, the government does create money and can create money. The private banks do create money as well. They were saying, let's shut down one right and use the other. It's feasible to use the government's money creation capacity to pay off private debt. And that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, so more base money in the system and less...
More base money,
and
or
less deposit money.
More fiat-based created money, less credit-created money. And one rejection people made to me about this idea was, well, if you do that, you reward people who took out debt. You can divide the general non-bank.
There will be inflation, of course.
Yeah, okay. But the main thing was say that it's moral hazard. You will reward people for gambling, okay? I said, well, actually, therefore, the only way to solve this is have a modern debt jubilee, where you use the government's money creation capacity to inject money into everybody's bank accounts on a per capita basis.
That sounds better, yeah.
And then the people who debt must pay their debt down. The people who don't have debt, they could spend it, but you could also say that let's also require the people who are savers who didn't go into debt and therefore get a cash injection, they can only buy corporate shares, which must also be used to reduce corporate debt. And what you do is democratise share ownership in a way which is the exact opposite of what quantitative easing has done, because quantitative easing, which is what the central banks have done since the crisis, has driven up the price of shares.
Yeah, so the rich people have benefited.
That's great for those who've got shares.
So this is the people's QE, actually.
People's QE would say, let's require you, if you're not a debtor, if you're in debt, we get you out of debt. If you're not a debtor, we give you money that must be used to buy shares, so you become a share owner.
That sounds too good to be true, and of course there's always
happen, of course.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. So the downside, apart from moral hazard, would probably be then inflation if it's too much. You have to do it in a drip fashion.
You'd have to test it out. If you ever gave it a chance, I certainly wouldn't say let's wipe off all the debt in one go. If you look at the level of private debt in America, it's now about 150% of GDP. I think America's safe range is somewhere below 70% of GDP. So you want to knock off 80% of GDP worth of debt. Yeah. I'm not going to say let's do that in one go.
It's a bit like cash for clunkers that they had in the US.
They had cash for clunkers. They did a whole lot of things like this. They did do initially, but they never carried them full.
It's too small.
There was one of Obama's schemes was to help mortgage holders get out of debt and get them out of bad contracts. Only I think less than 1,000 people got the benefit of that scheme. All the stuff was stolen by the financial sector instead.
But what I like about this is that it's going then to the people themselves, because if we, in a proper Keynesian fashion, would allow or motivate government to spend more on all sorts of projects, then you get all these bridges to nowhere, and there's so much inefficient spending already taking place at the government level.
Yeah,
because you've been, it's almost like schizophrenic in a way, because you've been very critical about many governments, and I think you also vie for Assange to be released and sent to Australia, and you've been criticizing, of course, also the UK. You're regular on RT. So on the one hand, you criticize the governments. On the other hand, in a way, you want government to step in if things.
Well, they're the only ones with the power to create money, apart from
but also
the
power
banks.
to start wars and like that.
Exactly.
The age of central banking has also been the age of mass wars, of course. So how are we going to avoid governments breaching
Well, I don't think we will.
No.
Frankly, I think what's going to happen instead is that all these, like I'll put all these theories forward, they'll be ignored. They won't. The solution will be ignored. What's going to happen is what happened in the Second World War, and that is when the Second World War began and Britain faced an existential threat of being literally, they were being potentially about to be invaded by Germany. Nobody said, we can't afford that extra bomb, okay? Because if you don't pay for the extra bomb, you might have to speak in German next week, next year. Not a bad language, but I would want to lead it voluntarily rather than because Hitler's telling me to speak German. So the budget deficit in Britain in 1940 was 40% of GDP. Okay, basically spend whatever you can to build as many Spitfires, have as many guns, as many uniforms, many people enlisted to stop us being invaded. Yeah. And what that meant was there was a dramatic level of spending drastically reduced the private debt level. In Britain's case, Britain had quite low private debt at the time. It fell from about 60% to 40% of GDP. But in America, it fell from, I think at the beginning of the Great Depression, the Second World War, something of the order of, say, 90% of GDP. By the end of the Second World War, it was 30% of GDP. So we actually managed to eliminate private debt by World War II. Yeah. I would like to do it slightly more peacefully.
Yeah, that would be nice.
I don't think it's going to happen. I think instead what's going to happen is a similar existential threat will occur. Finally, even Donald Trump will have to concede global warming is taking place. That'll probably be after Mar-a-Lago is hit by a tsunami, or a forced cyclone wipes out one of his golf clubs. And then when we realise we're facing an existential threat to the species on this planet, then nobody's going to say we can't afford that CO2 scrubber. We'll just basically mobilise as much as we can, go on effectively a war footing against climate change, and in that process, nobody will be able to spend relatively. We'll go into similar sort of rationing we had back in the Second World War, and private debt will be driven down simply by the mechanics of avoiding climate change.
Yeah, so private debt, we have to, and we sort of have to delever the coming time. We can use people's QE, we can use a debt jubilee. At the same time, we need to avoid to build up all this bubbly private debt again. I think you had a very interesting proposal too to look at rental income versus the versus.
Well, one of the reasons you've seen more of a bubble, like Germany had no housing bubble at all, and I've actually had colleagues tell me that they wanted to buy a property somewhere in rural Germany, a smallish town, and they agreed to the price because it seemed quite reasonable, and the mayor blocked the sale because the bugger wants too much. And they got the guy to drop the price by 15% before the sale went through. That wouldn't happen.
Yeah, and you have to bring in, of course, 20% or so deposit before you buy something.
So what we've allowed banks to lend money against collateral, and what that has done is driven up the asset prices, and there's a positive feedback.
There's 100% positive correlation between the amounts of debt issued and mortgage debt.
The actual correlation is between the change in new mortgages and the change in house prices. Yeah, and I've done the mathematics on this and doing work with, long overdue to publish it with Paul Omer on, but the basic argument is that what actually causes rising house prices is rising new mortgage debt.
But the government is there, of course, also playing a nefarious role by keeping interest rates so low.
That helped, but that's driven us into a sort of corner, because if you look at the amount of debt that's being, money you have to devote to debt service, back in the 1960s, interest rates were fairly similar to what they are now. Debt levels are 1/3 of what they are. So the debt servicing is like 3 times what it was in the 1960s. But by the 1980s or 1990s, interest rates have been driven up so much that the servicing costs were roughly what they are now. So people think we're at a sort of level of normal because the servicing cost now, when we've got low interest rates and high debt, is similar to what we had when we had high interest rates and lower debt, not as low as it was in the 60s. But the thing is, that system can only keep on going if people continue taking on new debt. Because a large part of the demand in the economy comes out of new credit. Now, when credit stops growing, the demand disappears and the economy plunges.
So it seems like unless we do a debt jubilee at some point, the whole thing will just
everybody's going to
stop because there's just too much debt.
Everybody's going to come as debt zombies, I call it in the book. And the debt zombies are countries with too much private debt that they're not able to reduce. Because the only way private debt's been reduced when it's been this large in the past has been through write-offs. Right. This is work by Richard Vague, who's an American philanthropist who started 2 of America's major credit card companies, is a billionaire. He won't tell me how much he's worth, but he's clearly a billionaire, and became worried about the level of mortgage debt back in the early 2000s because you thought, can my credit card customers pay off their credit cards when they have this much mortgage debt? And he's become a campaigner against private debt being allowed to be out of control. And he's commissioned a few studies. One of them looked at all the financial crises for as far back as they can find them in the data. They found about 150 around the world over the last 1.5 centuries. Said in every case bar two, I think, the crisis was only ended by writing the debt off. You didn't grow out of debt, and you couldn't export your way out of debt unless you're a place like Saudi Arabia, where the oil price goes up dramatically and you can pay it down.
And so that's something we should have done with Greece, of course, in the first place, in a proper way.
They should have written it off. Yeah, as Yanis was saying, you can't give somebody who's bankrupt more debt. So you have to write it off at some point. You have to acknowledge it. So my idea is a way of doing it simply, using it. But of course, it won't happen that way. And what it means is we'll be debt zombies instead.
Very interesting stuff, Steve. I see we've already been talking for like 50 minutes or so. It's
okay.
I could spend more hours with you here. Maybe we should do another episode one day, or but something maybe about your Patreon project, because you're a public intellectual. Of course, you also have your employment with the university. But I know you've been very active and energetic about divulging all your knowledge and your theories and trying to help people to understand what's going on. So it would be nice if people would support you even more. What's the site where they can find you?
It's a website called Patreon, so www.patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen.
No, that's easy. And people can sort of set up a donation on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's like Kickstarter, which of course is a one-off funding, but it's continuous. So you pledge to give a certain amount per month, and you give as little as $1 a month. I've had people giving as much as $300 a month.
That's great.
My basic thing is don't give me an amount of money which you're going to have to explain to your spouse. Okay, actual or hypothetical. Yeah. So the amount less than that is fine. So most of my support comes from people giving $10 a month for the podcast that I do. But the substantial number are just contributing $1 a month, $3 a month, and so on. And that's enabling me to continue doing what I'm doing without needing to worry about university bureaucrats and all that nonsense, so I can continue fighting for change in economics.
Great. Well, that's a lovely message to end this conversation. Thanks so much, Steve, and let's have a bite.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay.